Most waterfowl scientists believe that climate change will affect ducks and their habitats in coming years. This is America's duck factory, the prairie pothole region, the rolling plains of the Dakotas, eastern Montana, and the southern Canadian provinces. This is where most ducks flying across our flyways in the fall originate from. And it's in these wetlands, according to Dr. Carter Johnson of South Dakota State University, that climate change can alter.
Well, you know, our wetlands here, which are a wonderful legacy of the glaciers here in the north central states, are really a wonderful system. And they're productive because there's all that grass nearby, and they're sort of shallow, so they warm up quickly. There's fertile soils, and they produce an abundance of biology, abundance of life. Waterfowl, of course, are the things that we probably know most about in these wetlands. And so they're very valuable resources. But just think about a puddle of water sitting on the landscape in a climate like ours. We don't get a lot of rain. It's warm in the summer. It evaporates quickly. It's not going to take much of a change in the climate for those wetlands to dry up. And that's the real concern that we have, is they sit sort of on the knife edge all the time. But the 20th century was a pretty good climate for us. We had a lot of waterfowl production, a lot of other production. But we're concerned that the next century, the one we're in now, is likely to be much drier. And it won't take much to dry them up and to lose a lot of those benefits that they have been providing for us up until recently.
Scientists are also predicting a drier climate from the prairie pothole region westward to envelop the entire western area of the U.S. And that change, according to the majority of wildlife scientists, is likely to affect habitat there too, which will in turn affect wildlife that depends on that habitat. One trend today is that increasing numbers of wildlife administrators are now paying serious attention to climate change. One is John Cooper, who recently retired as South Dakota's Game Fish and Parks Department Secretary, where he spent a number of years. Coop is now retired. He continues, though, to work on Missouri River issues for South Dakota Governor Mike Rounds.
In my own personal opinion, because I think a lot of these issues about climate change and global warming, it's hard for people to really understand it because it's not right here. You can't grab a hold of it. You can't see it visually. So it's difficult to understand, and it is complicated, extremely complicated, so that in many cases people would have to do a lot of research to get a balanced idea of whether it's an issue or not an issue. In my own personal opinion, I think we should be concerned about it. I think that the evidence that I have seen, the research that's being done, and it's ongoing research, not just done by one side or the other, and some of the questions that have been asked by me have also been asked by other people who are in other professions. People who are involved in forestry are asking questions about climate change issues and what could or should happen in regards to management of forests.
Yes, it's always been a minority, I think, for people who didn't really believe either this couldn't happen or wasn't happening. But now the naysayers are scarce as hen's teeth, I'd say. It's very hard to find someone who will make that argument anymore. So the question is, do we go on 95%, 99% probability, or do we go with 1% or 5%? And I think I'd go with the 95%.
Big game animals aren't immune to the problems posed by climate change, and that includes western mule deer herds.
We're seeing it have a major impact on mule deer across the West as we see these droughts. And now, again, right now we're in the middle of a hard winter that we haven't seen for a while. Our deer populations have built. Now there's some areas where deer are in trouble. But where we're really seeing it change is in the drier climates, the desert climates. The habitat's changing to vegetation that doesn't really support mule deer. And we're starting to see some real declines in these desert areas, plus the lack of water. Mule deer need water in those desert ranges, and so we're seeing a dramatic change in the springs, in the seeps, and places where they were able to get water before. So that's been a big issue. We're talking about New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, southern California, some of those areas, but even up into southern Colorado. The one thing that we are seeing is, though, I guess you could say it's a positive, that the winters aren't as hard further north, and deer are actually responding to that, and are actually doing much better in some of the northern climates than they were, say, in the 70s and 80s. I think with mule deer right now it's a mixed bag. I think we're seeing like I say, we're starting to see things that they're changing. The fire regime across the West, these huge wildfires you're seeing are destroying excellent mule deer habitat, and they're being replaced by, exotic cheatgrass, plants that are really not good for anything. And so I would say probably if there's a change, it's probably more impacting them than it is benefiting them. But like I say, I think it's a mixed bag. It just depends on where you are.
Others, like John Cooper, a former wildlife administrator and himself an avid waterfowl hunter, see significant changes in migration patterns, especially for ducks.
The next question is, well, isn't that just cyclical? Isn't that just the way it is? Isn't that the way weather should be? And my point is, that might be true, but everything that we're seeing, the temperature changes earlier, the fact that our winters are milder, and the way that this migration is taking place are significant changes that I did not see in the previous 25 or 30 years that I've been doing this work.
While waterfowlers are eagerly looking forward to the fall, they're also concerned with what happens in the spring, the annual spring breeding season, because that's what determines the size of the fall flight. But most waterfowlers in all four flyways have grown accustomed to fall migrations occurring later each season.
The birds that we used to have here, I'll start with Canada geese and very quickly move to ducks. The Canada goose migration is significantly different than it was in the periods of time that I was out in the field. The 70s and the 80s, in through the early 90s, you could almost set your watch by the western prairie migration of western prairie flock of Canada geese and the tallgrass prairie flock of Canada geese would be all the way from Canada down into the Pierre area by November 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, and you'd have the overlap of both of those flocks, somewhere in the neighborhood of 325 to 375,000 geese, the first week or week and a half of November. Over the last 7 years, we are lucky if we see any of those western prairie birds by just after Thanksgiving. I've seen significant changes in the way that those birds have altered their migration. And on ducks, it's really amazing how much farther north those ducks have stayed and been able to feed on things up there that normally was not a crop in Canada. I mean, those birds are feeding on chickpeas and a whole series of different kinds of wheats that those Canadians and that cropping weren't able to support until we started getting some of this warmer weather. And now it takes a significant weather event, Tony, you and I have talked about this, to move those birds out of the southern Canadian provinces down through North Dakota and into South Dakota. And I get calls, and have gotten calls a lot, from friends of mine in places like Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana, people who I've known and worked with over the years, who said to me, "What in the world are you guys doing up there to shortstop all these birds?" And I tell them, it's not us. I guarantee you it would be, it's just the way that the whole weather pattern has changed, and the cropping methods and the crops that are being utilized have changed.
But late migrations will always be better than none at all, and you can only imagine the impact of drought conditions if they dry up the wetlands in the duck factory, the prairie pothole region.
Well, one calculation was made by another scientist a few years ago, and she took a look at droughts in the past and how that affected waterfowl populations, ducks in particular. And her estimate was that we could see the duck population drop by half between the year 2050 and 2100. So in 5 decades or so, we could be looking at half the numbers of ducks that we have now if the climatologists are right about this. And I think the Fish and Wildlife Service would say probably no season if we have half the population, or very restricted seasons, maybe both geographically and in terms of bag limit and number of days and so on. So the phrase duck season might be gone from our lexicon in 50 to 100 years.
You have a visual. Far-fetched? Well, we hope not. But if the prairie pothole region temperature rises by just 3 degrees centigrade and rainfall drops by 20%, the only area in the Midwest most likely to get enough rain to support breeding duck populations includes a tiny portion of southern Minnesota and north-central Iowa. In both areas, land prices have skyrocketed, and nearly all wetlands have been drained. That indeed would paint a bleak picture for waterfowl and waterfowl hunters.